Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't about mental illness. It was about people who see everything others miss and why this ability destroys them. In his clinical practice, Jung documented patients with what he called differentiated perception, individuals who could read micro-expressions, sense hidden emotions, and perceive psychological patterns that escaped everyone else. They saw through social masks, detected lies instantly, and felt the unconscious tensions in every room. Jung called this discovery dangerous because these people consistently ended up isolated, exhausted, and unable to maintain normal relationships. Not because they were unstable, but because seeing everything came with a psychological cost no one understood. Today I'll show you Jung's most dangerous discovery about people who see everything, and why he believed this rare ability either destroys you or transforms you into something extraordinary. The case that revealed Jung's most dangerous discovery began with a patient he described in his private notes, a highly introverted, intuitive type who came to him in 1913 during Jung's own psychological crisis following his break with Freud. This patient, representing what Jung would later categorize as the rarest personality type, possessed what he called undifferentiated intuitive perception. She could walk into any room and immediately sense the psychological atmosphere. Who was lying, who was in emotional pain, who harbored secret resentments. Jung wrote, "The patient displays an extraordinary capacity for perceiving unconscious contents in others, but this faculty appears to cause her considerable distress rather than advantage. She couldn't engage in small talk because she saw through every social facade. She couldn't maintain friendships because people felt exposed and uncomfortable around her. She couldn't hold employment because her presence disrupted the collective unconscious agreements that keep groups functioning." Jung realized he wasn't treating pathology. He was observing what happens when the unconscious becomes too conscious, when perception becomes too differentiated for social survival. He documented her describing people with startling accuracy. She spoke of others as if she had access to their private thoughts and hidden motivations. When I verify her observations through careful questioning, they prove remarkably accurate. This wasn't psychosis or delusion. This was consciousness so advanced it had become socially dangerous. But Jung discovered something even more disturbing. Because this patient's extraordinary perception seemed impossible to explain, he began investigating what he would later term participation mystique, the psychological phenomenon where individuals with highly differentiated intuition become overwhelmed by unconscious contents from others. Jung wrote in his Red Book period notes, "There are those among us whose psychic apparatus is so finely tuned that they absorb not merely conscious communications but the entire unconscious atmosphere of their environment." Modern research by Dr. Elaine Aron on highly sensitive persons validates Jung's early observations. Her research shows that roughly 20% of people have heightened sensory and emotional sensitivity. But Jung identified something more specific within his psychological typology, the introverted intuitive type, comprising roughly 1% of the population, who don't just feel deeply but perceive unconscious patterns with startling clarity. Jung observed that these individuals have what he called differentiated intuitive function. Their brains process not just obvious social cues, but unconscious emotional states, repressed content, and psychological patterns that others cannot detect. They see the depression behind forced smiles, sense the desperation beneath confident presentations, and feel the collective shadow that groups unconsciously agree to ignore. Jung wrote, "The danger lies not in the perception itself, but in the psychic isolation it creates. When one sees clearly what others cannot or will not see, one becomes a mirror that society cannot bear to look into." This creates what Jung called the problem of the superior function, when your greatest strength becomes your greatest burden because it separates you from collective, unconscious participation. But Jung discovered the real danger wasn't the perception itself, because people with highly differentiated perception see others' unconscious contents clearly. Therefore, they become targets for what Jung extensively documented as shadow projection, where people unconsciously attack them for reflecting what they refuse to acknowledge in themselves. Jung wrote in Psychology of the Unconscious, "Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent." But he discovered this principle extended to all relationships. When someone's shadow is reflected back through another person's clear perception, the unconscious mind has two choices: integrate the shadow or attack the mirror. Jung documented this pattern repeatedly in his clinical work. The person who sees clearly gets blamed for creating the problems they're merely observing. His patients with differentiated intuition experienced this constantly. When they would gently suggest that someone seemed troubled, that person would explode at them for being negative or creating drama. When they'd express concern about obvious problems, they'd be accused of being judgmental or manufacturing issues where none existed. Jung realized this wasn't coincidence, it was psychological defense. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, but for most people, it's easier to attack the person reflecting their shadow than to examine what's being reflected." This creates what Jung called the scapegoat phenomenon. Highly perceptive individuals often become the designated problem in every group they enter, not because they cause problems, but because they reveal problems that already exist in the collective unconscious. Jung observed, the bearer of superior perception becomes the repository for all that the group cannot consciously acknowledge about itself. This pattern explains why these individuals don't just feel misunderstood, they feel systematically targeted by a force they can't rationally explain. But Jung's most disturbing discovery was still to come. Jung observed that overwhelming perception manifested differently in different individuals. Therefore, he identified 4 distinct patterns within the introverted, intuitive type, each representing a different way of processing unconscious contents from others. Type 1. The feeling intuitive. Jung documented patients who combined introverted intuition with differentiated feeling function. These individuals don't just see what's happening psychologically, they feel it in their own bodies. They absorb others' emotions so completely, they often can't distinguish between their own feelings and those they've unconsciously absorbed. Jung wrote, "The feeling intuitive lives in a state of perpetual emotional contagion, experiencing the unlived emotions of everyone in their environment." Type 2. The thinking intuitive. These individuals see psychological patterns and predict behavioral outcomes with startling accuracy. Jung observed they could forecast relationship failures, career disasters, and personal breakdowns months before they occurred, not through logical analysis, but through unconscious pattern recognition. Jung noted they possess an uncanny ability to perceive the logical conclusions of unconscious processes that others cannot yet see. Type 3. The sensation intuitive. Jung documented patients who could sense the physical manifestations of psychological states in others, detecting illness before symptoms appeared, sensing fatigue before it was acknowledged, or feeling the bodily tension that indicated emotional distress. Jung wrote, "These individuals serve as early warning systems for psychological and physical disease in their environment." Type 4. The pure intuitive, the rarest type Jung encountered, combined introverted intuition with what he called undifferentiated auxiliary function. They saw everything, but had difficulty organizing or expressing their perceptions coherently. Jung observed, they live in a state of perpetual overwhelm, receiving vast amounts of unconscious information without adequate psychological structure to process it. Understanding your specific pattern is crucial because each type requires different approaches to what Jung called the integration challenge. But first, you need to understand why Jung considered this discovery so dangerous, because Jung observed the devastating effects of undifferentiated perception on his patients. He concluded that seeing everything without proper psychological integration posed genuine dangers to both individual and collective well-being. Jung identified 3 specific dangers that made this discovery so threatening: collective unconscious disruption, psychological isolation, and identity dissolution. Jung wrote, the individual who perceives too clearly threatens the collective agreements upon which social cohesion depends. When someone sees through the shared illusions that hold groups together, the unspoken agreements to ignore certain truths, they become a destabilizing force. He observed that organizations, families, and societies function partly through collective unconscious agreements about what will and won't be acknowledged. The highly perceptive individual inadvertently violates these agreements simply by existing authentically. The second danger, psychological isolation, is when differentiated perception creates what Jung called the problem of superior function. When your greatest psychological strength becomes the source of your greatest suffering, he wrote, the curse of consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not possess it. The individual becomes an island of awareness in an ocean of unconsciousness. This isolation isn't just social, it's existential. These individuals often report feeling like they're living in a different reality from everyone around them. The third danger, identity dissolution, is most dangerous of all. Jung found that people who absorb unconscious contents from others often lose contact with their own authentic personality. They become so flooded with external psychological material that they can't distinguish between their inner world and what they're absorbing from their environment. Jung called this participation mystique, a state where psychological boundaries dissolve and the individual becomes merged with collective, unconscious contents. He wrote, the danger is not merely social exile but psychological annihilation, the complete loss of individual identity in favor of collective possession. This is why Jung considered the integration of superior perception not just therapeutically important but psychologically urgent, because unintegrated superior perception posed such dangers. Therefore, Jung developed what he called the individuation process, a systematic approach to maintaining individual identity while developing conscious relationship with unconscious contents. Phase 1. Recognition and differentiation. Jung taught his highly perceptive patients to first recognize when they were absorbing psychological material that wasn't their own. He called this conscious discrimination, the ability to distinguish between authentic inner experience and unconsciously absorbed external content. Jung wrote, the first task is to establish what belongs to you and what belongs to others. Without this discrimination, there can be no individual development. Technique. Jung instructed patients to spend time in complete solitude daily, allowing absorbed material to settle so they could recognize their own authentic psychological voice. Phase 2. Shadow integration. Jung discovered that people who see others' shadows clearly often do so because they haven't integrated their own. The more you deny your own capacity for deception, selfishness, or cruelty, the more disturbed you'll be by seeing these qualities in others. Jung wrote, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, but only if we have the courage to look inward rather than remaining focused outward. Shadow integration means acknowledging that you contain every human quality you observe in others. This doesn't make you a bad person, it makes you a complete person who can see clearly without judgment. Phase 3. Conscious participation. The final phase involves what Jung called conscious participation in the collective unconscious, the ability to engage with others' psychological contents without being overwhelmed or losing your individual identity. Jung wrote, "The individuated person can serve as a bridge between conscious and unconscious, helping to make the unconscious conscious in others without sacrificing their own psychological integrity." This requires developing what Jung called psychological containers, the ability to hold others' unconscious contents temporarily while maintaining awareness that they are not your own. Because Jung understood that superior perception either destroys or transforms individuals, he studied historical figures to understand the difference between successful integration and psychological breakdown. The case of nature, unintegrated perception, Jung was deeply influenced by nature's philosophy, but observed how his superior perception ultimately led to psychological collapse. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung wrote about nature's ability to see through social, religious, and philosophical facades with devastating clarity. However, Jung noted that nature never learned to integrate these insights constructively. Instead of using perception in service of healing, nature wielded it as a weapon against society. Jung wrote, "Nature possessed extraordinary insight into human nature, but he remained identified with his superior function rather than integrating it into a balanced personality." Jung observed that nature's isolation and eventual breakdown represent what happens when superior perception remains unintegrated. The individual becomes consumed by what they see rather than transformed by it. The case of Meister Eckhart, successful integration, Jung extensively studied the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart, whom he considered an example of successfully integrated superior perception. Eckhart possessed what Jung called mystical intuition, the ability to perceive spiritual and psychological realities that others could not access. But unlike nature, Eckhart channeled his insights into compassionate service. Jung wrote, "Eckhart transformed his superior perception into wisdom that could nourish others without overwhelming them. He saw clearly but spoke in ways that invited understanding rather than resistance." Jung noted that Eckhart's success came from what he called conscious humility, the recognition that superior perception is a gift to be shared wisely, not a weapon to be wielded. Jung's own integration journey involved confronting his overwhelming perception during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious from 1913 to 1919, recorded in the Red Book. Jung wrote, "I was menaced by a psychosis and was saved only by my ability to understand what was happening to me through my work with patients." His superior perception of unconscious contents, both his own and others, nearly destroyed him until he learned to integrate these experiences consciously. Jung's breakthrough came when he realized that his overwhelming perceptions weren't pathological, but evolutionary. They represented consciousness attempting to evolve beyond current collective limitations. This realization transformed his approach to patients with similar gifts because individuals with superior perception often face isolation. Therefore, Jung emphasized the crucial importance of finding the few who understand, others capable of engaging with differentiated consciousness without defensiveness. Jung wrote in The Development of the Personality, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But this privilege cannot be realized in isolation. It requires witnessing by those capable of recognizing authenticity." Jung identified three essential types of relationships for the highly perceptive individual: fellow individuated persons, those engaged in individuation, and natural containers. Jung wrote, "The individuated person recognizes another individuated person immediately. There is a quality of presence, an authenticity that cannot be fabricated. These connections often happen instantly and intensely. You recognize each other as members of what Jung called the conscious minority. These relationships are rare but essential for psychological survival. With fellow individuated persons, you can be completely authentic without fear of overwhelming or threatening them. Those engaged in individuation are people actively involved in their own psychological growth, therapy, inner work, spiritual practice, who can often handle superior perception without defensiveness. Jung observed that they may not possess it themselves, but they understand its value. Jung wrote, "Those who have begun to know themselves can bear to be known by others." Natural containers refer to individuals who, while not possessing superior perception themselves, have what Jung called the natural container function, the ability to hold psychological content without being overwhelmed. These might be mature individuals who have weathered significant life challenges. The recognition process involves asking genuine questions about your observations rather than immediately defending against them, acknowledging contradictions and limitations without shame. They demonstrate what Jung called psychological mindedness, interest in inner reality, and maintain emotional stability when confronted with uncomfortable truths. They show genuine curiosity about consciousness and growth. Gradual revelation protocol is a careful process Jung taught for revealing perceptive abilities. Start with small, gentle observations. Notice their response pattern to feedback. Assess whether they become defensive or curious. Gradually increase depth based on their demonstrated capacity. Always frame insights as offerings rather than pronouncements. Jung emphasized, the goal is not to find people who accept everything you see, but to find people who can engage with your perceptions as valuable contributions to understanding rather than threats to their self-image. Because integrated superior perception serves both individual and collective development, Jung viewed successful individuation as essential not just for personal well-being, but for the evolution of human consciousness itself. Jung wrote in The Undiscovered Self, "The individual has always been the carrier of the living spirit, the one who brings about the change in society." He believed that individuals who successfully integrate superior perception become what he called culture carriers, people who help consciousness evolve. The 4 stages of transformation are recognition without overwhelm, integration without isolation, service without sacrifice, and legacy without attachment. Stage 1 involves acknowledging your perceptive abilities without being crushed by them, what Jung called conscious acceptance of the superior function. He wrote, "The beginning of wisdom is the recognition of what one actually is, not what one wishes to be or fears to be." Stage 2 is learning to use perception constructively while maintaining meaningful relationships, social individuation. Jung observed that the individuated person does not withdraw but engages more consciously with the world. Stage 3 is making perception a gift offered to others, conscious participation, serving without depleting oneself. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are and then to offer that authentic self in service of the whole." The final stage, legacy without attachment, involves using perception to contribute to collective consciousness evolution without attachment to recognition, transcendent function. Jung observed, the individuated person works for the future, not for personal recognition in the present. The integration becomes cultural medicine. Jung believed that individuals who successfully integrate superior perception serve a vital evolutionary function. They see what collective consciousness is not yet ready to acknowledge, helping to prepare humanity for necessary developmental steps. Jung wrote, "What is not brought to consciousness comes to us as fate." Highly perceptive individuals who learn integration help make unconscious contents conscious before they manifest destructively in collective behavior. But Jung warned about specific pitfalls that can derail this transformation. The path of integrating superior perception contains dangers, and he documented the most common ways individuals derail their own process: inflation trap, withdrawal, and justification, helpers, and overwhelm return. The inflation trap occurs when individuals become identified with their superior function rather than integrating it consciously. Jung warned, "The danger is that the ego identifies with the archetype, leading to an inflation that cuts the individual off from human relationships." Such individuals often fall into the prophet complex, believing they must save everyone from unconsciousness, leading to preaching, judgment, and isolation. Jung observed, "The moment one believes oneself to be the bearer of absolute truth, one has fallen into the trap of unconscious possession by the very forces one seeks to understand." Withdrawal and justification happen when individuals use their perception to justify complete withdrawal from society, believing others are too unconscious to be worth engaging, which Jung recognized as spiritual superiority disguised as wisdom. Jung wrote, "True individuation requires engagement with the unconscious world, not escape from it. The hermit who withdraws from life has not transcended it, but has been defeated by it." Helpers, some highly perceptive individuals become addicted to being needed. They define themselves through their ability to see and help others, losing contact with their own inner development. Jung warned, "When perception becomes identity, the person disappears behind the function. This is not individuation, but its opposite, the sacrifice of personality to role." Overwhelm return refers to the regression during stress or major transitions where individuals stop maintaining boundaries and become flooded again with unconscious contents. Jung emphasized, integration is not a permanent achievement, but a dynamic process requiring constant conscious attention. He developed ongoing practices, solitude, conscious engagement, shadow work, connection, and creative expression to maintain healthy integration. Superior perception within the collective psychological development context is vital. Jung saw highly perceptive individuals as serving as consciousness pioneers, individuals whose psychological development precedes collective readiness. Throughout history, such individuals appeared before their insights were integrated into society, acting as scouts for future cultural transformation. In the modern era, Jung believed highly perceptive individuals might sense psychological patterns that explain collective behaviors, environmental and social unsustainability, spiritual possibilities beyond current religious frameworks, and technological implications. Early warning systems for what the culture needs to address. Jung's insight was that these individuals feel the collective problems first, and most intensely, making their personal symptoms reflections of cultural needs. The service without martyrdom entails that superior perception should be integrated consciously, not suffered unconsciously. Jung's key message: the goal isn't to be a martyr to consciousness, but to be a bridge between what is and what's becoming. At the highest level, the transcendent function allows individuals to serve consciousness evolution naturally, embodying more conscious ways of being. Remember the patient from 1913, the introverted intuitive, whose life transformed after years of working through Jung's individuation process. She learned to distinguish her own psychological contents from what she absorbed, found work as a counselor, built meaningful relationships, and understood her perception as a gift requiring conscious development. Jung's most dangerous discovery is that some individuals are born with consciousness exceeding collective readiness. This perception can destroy them through isolation or overwhelm, or transform them into what humanity needs for its psychological evolution. Your superior perception isn't a malfunction. It's an advanced feature of consciousness development. You're not broken because you see everything others miss. You're psychologically ahead of your time. The question isn't whether to suppress perception, but whether you'll develop the skills needed to integrate it consciously. Jung's individuation method offers a path from dangerous isolation to conscious service, overcoming overwhelm, transforming perception into wisdom, and turning a psychological curse into cultural medicine. Your gift is not your burden, your unconscious relationship to it is. Learn to integrate consciously, and you become what Jung believed highly perceptive individuals are meant to be: consciousness, pioneers preparing humanity for inevitable psychological development, yet not yet obvious. Most people who see everything never learn to use what they see wisely. The danger lies not in perception itself, but in failing to develop a conscious relationship with these extraordinary abilities. You are not too much for this world. You are exactly what consciousness evolution requires. Once you learn to wield your perception consciously, as Jung learned to wield his, the danger of seeing everything isn't that you see too much, it's that you might never learn to see with the integration and wisdom your gifts demand. If you recognize yourself in Jung's description of the highly perceptive individual, you're part of a rare psychological type that Jung believed is essential for consciousness evolution. Share in the comments which type of differentiated perceiver you are. Your individuation journey, viduation, connects with others walking the same path. Subscribe for more insights into Jung's discoveries about psychological development that transcend collective unconscious limitations. If you're ready to explore more of Jung's insights about psychological types that don't fit conventional patterns, check out my video on 7 dangerous Carl Jung psychology places that destroy your mind, where I reveal the psychological environments that are particularly toxic for highly sensitive and perceptive individuals, and Jung's strategies for protecting your consciousness while engaging with an unconscious world. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.